Good evening,
Good
Dr.
evening.
Chavis.
How are you? It's so good to see you, and thank you for having me on this important program.
Well, it is so good to see you. I'm excited about tonight's conversation. I want to say welcome to everyone that has tuned in and joined us. Um, for those of you who have not joined the show before or participated in one of our IG Live conversations, my name is Jerica Richardson, and I serve as the Senior Vice President for Equitable Justice and Strategic Initiatives here at the National Urban League. And so really our Justice Now series and conversation is designed to elevate important topics and issues that are important and critical for the Black community, other communities of color, and other marginalized communities. And so tonight, our focus is going to be on the importance of Black media, Black journalists, and telling stories from the African American and the Black perspective in this country. And I am delighted to be joined by Dr. Benjamin Chavis Jr. And Dr. Chavis is currently the president and CEO of the National Newspaper Publishers Association. But I'll say, in addition to all of that, Dr. Chavis is known to so many of us as both an entrepreneur, a global leader, an educator, a civil rights icon, quite frankly, because he has served as the president of the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, better known as the NAACP, in years past. And for a lot of our millennials and some of our younger viewers, I want to lift up for you all that Dr. Chavis was also the president and CEO and co-founder of the Hip Hop Summit Action Network. Dr. Chavis, welcome. I'd love it if you just share with folks a little bit about the National Newspaper Association and your work there, as well as any other highlights from your bio that you think is relevant to tonight's conversation.
Well, first of all, thank you very, very much. I salute you for all of what you do. And of course, the National Urban League is one of our most important national civil rights organizations. I bring you greetings this evening from the National Newspaper Publishers Association. We represent the Black press of America. And I'm pleased to report to you that this year, 2022, marks the 195th year of the Black press of America. Since 1827, when Freedom's Journal was first published in New York City on March 16, 1827, for 195 years, the Black press has not only reported the news, but been an advocate for freedom, justice, and equality. Today, we have 236 African-American owned newspapers and multimedia companies who are members of the NNPA. And I'm so proud that it's intergenerational. And you will be pleased to know that nearly 50% of all of our NNPA member publishers are sisters, Black women publishers. So we are intergenerational. We have gender equality. We're in all of the urban areas as well as the suburban areas and some rural areas across the country. We're in 48 of 50 states, but digitally we reach the whole United States, including Alaska and Hawaii.
Well, thank you for sharing that background. And I'm so heartened to hear about the anniversary. I mean, we know that since dating back all the way to the 19th century, that the Black press has been really instrumental in not only telling the stories of our people, but pushing and advocating and really lifting up the need for change in this country in so many areas, especially as it relates to civil rights, equity, and justice. But I do want to take a step back because, you know, I'd be remiss if I didn't say that there have been challenges for the Black press and for Black media companies. And I will say from the increasingly digital landscape. I'm happy to hear that you have diversity within the ranks of the National Newspaper Association. But I would love to hear a little bit more from you about the resilience of the Black media and the Black press in this country and how they're really stepping up to the challenge of really sharing information during this digital age.
Well, thank you. even before the digital age, the black press was facing challenges because we were not getting equity in terms of advertising dollars that keeps black media in business. But during the digital age, an additional challenge because we had to transform and transfer from the print platform to the digital platform.
Mhm.
I'm pleased to report to you that of our 236 member newspapers, most of them have engaged in what's called digital transformation. They're still printing, but they also complement the print now with digital components, with digital formats. Most of our publications are also online. So we used to publish once a week when it was just print, but now we publish every day. Our websites are updated every day. And so I'm very pleased with the digital transformation that's taken place. It's caused additional revenue streams into the black press. But overarching, I still must report to you that even in the digital space, black-owned media still does not get its fair share of economic dollars, of advertising dollars. Even though African Americans are consumers in the American economy, over $1 trillion per year that African Americans spend in this economy, a lot of the major companies that benefit from our consumerism do not advertise adequately. Some do advertise, but not proportion to the dollars that are spent with them. So that's our biggest challenge, getting equity in the advertising dollars.
So why do what do you, I guess, attribute to that challenge and why there is not more investment in and Black periodicals and media outlets, Dr. Chavis?
Well, I think it's part of the systemic racism of our country. We still have made enormous progress. I've been involved in the civil rights movement personally for over 60 years, and I've seen great progress. But I must say, parenthetically, that we still have a long ways to go. And of course, the reason why we're still in business, we do get advertising dollars, but it could be an increase in the advertising dollars. The browning of America is a fact. It's a demographic fact. And because of the browning of America, you would think that the major retailers, the major companies that produce products and goods and services to sell to the American public would also have a browning of their balance sheets in terms of the advertising dollars. That has not happened. But since George Floyd's murder, something interesting has happened. I want to report to you that a lot of these companies now at least hire people in diversity education, diversity inclusion, these officers who are now in these companies are trying to make movement. Also, if you look at the C-suite of a lot of these major Fortune 500 companies, we still don't have enough African Americans in seats in the decision making of these companies. So we've made progress. I want to report that to you tonight. But I also want to say that the gap, the wealth gap, the economic development gap, the economic empowerment gap, the economic involvement gap is still too wide between blacks and whites and between communities of color and non-communities of color in America.
Well, I'm so glad you lifted that up. I mean, this division was created after the tragic deaths of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, and so many others. We really saw a social justice awakening in this country. And I will say, I look back to the days when I started in my career. I started out as a journalist, first in public radio and television, and then in network news. The changes that you are starting to see in corporate America, although we acknowledge that there needs to be more, I think I would argue that a lot of my counterparts and colleagues early on in my career felt that those changes were still needed in the as far as diversity and mainstream newsrooms. And I think if we take a look, my team actually pulled this Pew poll for me, and it said that if we're looking at these media organizations, that a lot of journalists feel that there still is not enough racial and ethnic diversity. And this is post George Floyd. 52% of them says there's not enough. And so, Dr. Chavis, what do you have to say to that? Obviously journalists are ringing the alarm about all these other facets of society that are not as equitable and just as they should be. What should we be doing to support Black journalists and other journalists of colors that are in these mainstream newsrooms?
Well, I think we have to have a two-pronged strategy. We first have to demand that the mainstream press has further diversity, equity, and inclusion, from the C-suite down to journalists who are out in the field bringing in the news or reporting news. And this is broadcast journalism as well as print journalism, and now I would say social media journalism. Journalism, the industry has changed. But they used to say, well, we couldn't find enough blacks qualified. You can't make that excuse now. We are, some instance, overqualified, given all of the experience and all of the great work that our schools of journalists, particularly those at HBCUs, are producing great talent, great skill, great experience. So the talent pool is there. But yet, in terms of network television and some of the major dailies, like the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Los Angeles Times, Chicago Tribune, if you look at those newsrooms, they still are inadequate. If you look at AP or others of the major or the global news service, you still find, yes, there are some African Americans and some other people called there, but not at the proportionality. Equity means proportionality.
Mm-hmm.
They have not reached the equity threshold yet. Is there more diversity in mainstream media? Yes, but it's not equitable yet. So we got to keep pushing. One of the things I always say out of the civil rights movement, once we win some freedom, we got to continue to fight for more freedom. Because if you ever relax, the very freedoms that we had will be taken away. Look at the Voting Rights Act of 1965. The Supreme Court took out some of the various measures of the Voting Rights Act. If you look at what's going on now with the FCC or the Federal Trade, these regulatory bodies, I think need to be much stronger in enforcing diversity, equity, and inclusion. I said two-pronged, but I'm going to talk about Black-owned media. I think Black journalists have a great opportunity, a career opportunity, to work for Black-owned media. And I think that as I look around, I know in a lot of the members of the NNPA, we're looking for talented, gifted, and committed journalists. So I would say we have to continue to push mainstream media, but don't forget about our own media in our own community. Because at the end of the day, it is those Black-owned media outlets that's really going to tell the truth consistently. You talked about resilience. Resilience is in the DNA of Black Americans. It's in the DNA of people. But we have to express ourselves, our resilience, in ways that connects not only with the past, but projects and helps shape a better future.
I love that. I mean, there was just so much to unpack in just that comment there. And I'm glad you mentioned HBCU. So shout out to all the Howard and Hampton and Clark Atlanta University and other HBCUs across the country. I know you all have so many really strong programs in the media. And if we take a look at a lot of the journalists and commentators that we see on television today, whether it's in Black media or mainstream media, so many of them have come from our HBCUs. And so, we cannot forget that. And while you've been talking, there actually has been some questions in the chat. I think there are folks, young journalists, folks that are either recent graduates or soon to be recent graduates who have questions. One of the questions is, are there any early career opportunities for aspiring journalists? So maybe if you could take a step back and talk about that.
Yes, I'm always encourage students who, even while they're in college, even while they're maybe even in community college or four-year college, get an apprenticeship. Mentorship is so important. Yes, getting that degree, but it's how you apply that degree. So the earlier you have hands-on experience as being a journalist, hands-on experience in broadcasting, hands-on experience in being a videographer, being an editor. One of the things I'm so proud of, you mentioned that years ago, Russell Simmons and I uh, co-founded the Hip Hop Summit Action Network. In fact, next year, can you believe it will be the 50th anniversary of hip hop? Hip hop has been around for 5 decades. Now what started in the South Bronx almost 50 years ago is now a global phenomenon. Why am I mentioning hip hop? Because we are a blessed people. We set trends. Hip hop culture has set trends in fashion, in music, and culture, and art, and entertainment that it's not just in the United States, it's all over the world. Correspondingly, our journalists, therefore, particularly those who are looking for career paths, you should also look not only in terms of domestic career opportunities in journalism and media, but also global. We live in a global village, and the extent to which we can not only connect news, connect culture, connect entertainment, connect sports in a global sphere, there's a wellspring of new opportunities out there, given all of the technology that is available to aspiring journalists.
Well, one of the questions, thank you for that. One of the questions we have is, who are the mentors? I think we see amazing folks doing amazing things from our community. But for those that are,
Well,
either in the early stages or even mid-career folks, like myself, who are the mentors that we should be looking to?
Well, if you go to nnpa.org and go down and look at the membership, you'll see the listing of the 236 African-American owned newspapers across the country. That's one place where you can get great experience, great mentorship, great apprenticeship. Another place is our HBCUs, which you mentioned. I think that our historically Black colleges and university have done an excellent job in providing education to the next generation of journalists. I just want to repeat something that James Baldwin once told me. He said that the pen is mightier than the sword. Mm. That pen, and I would ask all of the young journalists who are watching this program tonight, this Instagram Live tonight, how are you using your pen? What are you writing about? And how what you are writing about reflects the reality of the culture, of the journey, of the struggle, of the aspirations of the communities in which we emerge from. There's so much good news out there that sometimes the mainstream media does not cover. That's where the Black press comes in, striving for excellence. Not only striving for excellence, but attaining excellence in so many fields. The STEM field. You'd be surprised how many young sisters and brothers in STEM fields doing great work, but they don't get coverage. It's almost as if you have to do something negative in American society to get media attention. I want us to focus on those success stories, those attaining excellence, interdisciplinary in all the fields of study. Lastly, I would say that to be a good journalist is not only to be a good writer, a good communicator, but also a good researcher. It's so important that we have investigative journalism. So we're just not taking what someone else says for granted, but we dig deeper for the facts and the reality. I'm very optimistic. I want to say this about the program tonight, because when I visit the various journalism schools, including my alma mater, Howard University, or I go down to Clark, Atlanta, or one of the other schools, Texas Southern, all over across the country, at Tennessee State, I'm always impressed with the hunger and thirst of these young journalists, not only to go get a good job, make good money, but more importantly, to more accurately and authentically represent the progress of our people.
I think that's really important. And I want to underscore the point that you made about research. I think in this day and age where we have social media, we have access to the internet. People can get information, they can get news, they can hear things live and in real time. But we cannot, I think, discount the importance of research and fact checking, because we've seen that there's a lot of things out there that where information that's illegitimate is shared and catches fire, and can really change the narrative that's out there, and put a lot of misinformation and some disinformation out there. And I also think it's important that we have this conversation and we focus on research and knowing our homework, doing our homework and knowing our history, because we see in this country, our history, the history and the experience of African Americans and people of color in this country really is in danger of being suppressed, wiped away, and wiped out. And I really think that is part of why it's so important that we lift up Black journalists, Black media, Black press, and Black voices. What is your thoughts about how we push back on this, backlash that we're seeing in this country, this attack, these conversations on critical race theory that quite frankly is about truth telling? What is the role and responsibility of Black journalists in this fight?
The role and responsibility of Black journalists uh, in our fight, in our struggle for freedom, justice, and equality, one is to tell the truth and to find out what the truth really is, and not to accept the revisionists who are out there trying to revise it. You'd be surprised. I read a lot of writings about what happened in the 1960s, and most of those writings are not accurate. I think we need to report our own stories, tell our own stories, tell our own narratives, rather than us react negatively to the misstatement or to the wrongdoing, wrong storytelling. And I think that Black journalists have an opportunity as well as responsibility to further unveil some of the truth about lynchings, some of the truth about the history of the oppression of Black people in agriculture days, on farms. We really about other incidents even prior to slavery and the role that African Americans played in ending slavery, what happened in during Reconstruction and post-Reconstruction. And even today, I think there's so many great triumphant stories, again, that we need to tell in our communities, in our urban communities as well as our rural communities. Look what just happened in Jackson, Mississippi, and connecting that dot to what happened in Flint, Michigan. Where are environmental justice journalists, where to help us greater expose the social determinants of health? One thing that COVID exposed all these pre-existing conditions in our community. Where these pre-existing conditions come? Why do we disproportionately have asthma? Why do we disproportionately have high blood pressure or cancer or heart disease? All these things need to be further investigated, not just to report the fact, but report the fact in a way that helps us improve our overall quality of life. To me, we should have an objective of what we do. It's just not reporting for the sake of reporting. It's reporting for the sake of saving lives, empowering lives, and shaping a better future for all of God's people, particularly those who have historically been disenfranchised.
I love that we start and we need to focus on having an objective, not just doing, not just writing, not just talking for the sake of doing so. That we are really trying to bring light to a lot of things. And I will say many of these stories that you pointed out, that you've lifted up, the reason we know about them, the reason that they have become part of the mainstream conversation is because they were broken by or told by Black journalists. I remember being in the newsroom and really listening to Black radio and reading Black newspapers and fighting in editorial meetings and conversations just to be able to tell the stories that we knew was happening, the Black American community knew was happening, but it wasn't reaching Americans across the board. And it's important for us both to be agitators from the outside and lift these things up, to be really the check on our federal government, the check on our institutions, but to fight in institutions and outside of institutions, because if we're not doing the work, quite frankly, I don't know who will be. And I will say this, we've learned a lot, especially in 2020. So much of that information has come from citizen journalists, a lot of folks from our community who, armed with cell phones and other, equipment, have been able to tell stories in real time that before, you may never have heard about it, and that may never have reached a newspaper or a large newspaper or mainstream media. Um, what has changed, and are there any thoughts from you, Dr. Chavis, about what mainstream media can learn from Black media?
Well, I think mainstream media, there are three things that mainstream media can learn from African American and other media owned by communities of color. Number one, stories are local stories before they become national and global stories. And one of the great things about the Black press of America, we're on the ground. We're up close. We live in the communities where news is made, where analysis are pertinent. And sometimes our reality in many of these communities is a little different from how they're ultimately reported. For example, when there was issues and still issues about crime in our community and about policing in our community and about whether or not African Americans are safe, have a relationship, an accountable relationship with law enforcement. Now, there are two things. I'm so pleased that we now have an African American woman on the Supreme Court, a freedom fighter on the Supreme Court of the United States, because much of what's faced in our communities is judicial racism, judicial discrimination. We have a lot of people who are languishing in prison who should not be in prison. Who's going to tell those stories if it wasn't for the Black press? And now there's something called the Innocence Project, where they find out they've held people for many years. Some people are able to get out, but it comes always from someone telling their story. You'd be surprised. You may not be surprised. I get a lot of mail as the head of the NMPA from inmates, from prisoners, male, female, young people, juvenile institutions, who feel they've been locked away unjustly, don't have lawyers, don't have adequate legal representation, and they feel that nobody cares about them. I make sure we answer all those letters. We make sure that we send reporters in those communities to cover those prisons, to cover those jails, to cover those institutions. That's just one example. And then the third thing I think mainstream media can learn from Black-owned media in particular is that our news, our lifestyle comes in a certain cultural context. And a lot of times I think mainstream media does not understand Black culture and trying to put down Black culture rather than lift Black culture up. For example, hair. All these controversies about how sisters wear their hair or how brothers wear their hair, without understanding that how we wore our hair, even before slavery, was a statement of our identity, has an identity, how it's shaped, how it's curled, how it's plaited, how it's woven, how it's weaved. And a lot of times I've had young people that have been expelled from school because the teachers or the ministry didn't like the way their hair looked. I mean, those are stories. Who's going to report those stories if we don't report them?
I think that's a really great point. Our hair tells our story, right? It tells our lived experience. It tells our history. It tells, from whence we come and where we are going and where we have been. And very much wrapped up into that, I think the point that you're touching on is identity. Yes. And I think as we continue to struggle with systemic racism and institutional racism in this country, there needs to be more of a connection with the African American identity and the African American experience. What advice do you give to journalists? Some may be in newsrooms owned by people of color, and some might be in newsrooms that are owned by folks who are not of color. As they're growing and as they're creating and they're, working to tell the truth and to lift up stories, sometimes that don't necessarily get the coverage that they desire. What advice do you have to them for being courageous and being able to stand in their truth and embrace their identity and not feel like it's something that they have to suppress in any way, shape, or form in order to get ahead and advance?
Well, thank you. That's an excellent question. First of all, I don't think anyone is born a racist. I think it's part of the social conditioning. I think it's part of the miseducation, as Carter G. Woodson would say. It's the miseducation of Americans. And that's why this attempt now to ban books, to suppress knowledge that quote unquote makes some people feel uncomfortable because they don't want to hear about the horrors and the terror of slavery or what has happened to persons of color for centuries in this country. I think truth is always the best policy. Even in the Bible, it says truth will set you free, but you got to get the truth. And so, yes, journalists, no matter what type of newsroom you are working in or apprenticing in, you should always seek that truth and have the courage to report the truth once the truth is sought after and found and collaborated. Keep in mind, you want to make sure that your truth, I have this saying, that truth stands on its own. Our job is to get it out there. And people can always debate whether or not they want to hear the truth or whether or not they even like the truth. But the fact that you have the courage to report the truth, that starts a healing. I think that our nation is long overdue for a racial healing, is long overdue for a racial truth-telling, is long overdue for not necessarily pointing fingers, but to see our common humanity. And I think one of the myths about white supremacy is that somehow God made a mistake by creating some people one way and other people another way. To me, that's blasphemous. So even from a religious perspective, I think racism always has to be challenged. We should not accept it. We should expose it. And we should always be having the courage to tell the truth about it.
Well said. And you know, I would be remiss if we're talking about challenging racism and being honest. I think there we are grappling with a lot of changes in this country, a lot of decisions that are impacting marginalized communities, not for the good. And as we head into these midterm elections, what is the role and the importance of Black journalists in their coverage of these upcoming elections? And quite frankly, the general elections, the presidential elections that will follow them.
Well, particularly African American journalists and media owners and publishers and distributors of our content. First and foremost, we have to remind people about the price that we've already paid to get the right to vote. I think a lot of times, my dear sister, we take for granted sometimes where we are today in 2022. What freedoms we do have, what progress that has been made has come at a cost, has come at a sacrifice, you know, and when we shouldn't have to twist people's arms to go out to vote when the vote should be seen as something precious. So the journalists in our community, yes, we have to somehow use the kind of words and the headlines that not only reawaken people to how important, how sacred this midterm election is going to be, but we have to encourage massive turnout. And it's interesting that there are some groups in America that are paying people not to vote. They're paying people to write stories that disencourages, particularly young people, not to vote. I've monitored social media a lot. You know, I'm looking at it and I see a lot of, if I could use this term, there's a lot of shade being thrown on voting. Why? You know, well, why are people trying to make us underestimate or undervalue our tradition, our history? Voting, a lot of people died, went to jail to get the right to vote. So to me, when those polls open up, if nobody else is in line, we ought to be in line. And know how long we have to stay in line. Don't get out of that line until you cast that vote. Because you're not only casting a vote for yourself, you're casting your vote for all those brothers and sisters that pay the ultimate price so that we can have the right to vote. To me, democracy is on the ballot. Equity is on. We just talked about diversity, equity, and inclusion. That's on the ballot. We got to vote diversity. We got to vote equity. We got to vote and help shaping a better future for ourselves. And of course, voting is not the all-getter, but voting is a very important step. We also have to work on our economic development in our community. I know This has been sponsored by the National Urban League. And if there's any group that has really promoted economic development, economic justice, economic awareness, it's the National Urban League, and they're so appreciated for what you continue to do to connect these dots between social justice, economic justice.
Well, we appreciate that. And you're right. It's all connected, right? All of these are our freedoms. I saw someone in the chat say they just want us to get exhausted, right? And, you know, we can't get weary. We can't get tired. We have to continue marching on because as you see, with one freedom is eroded, then comes another, right? And so that is why I think the power of our voices are so important. And Dr. Chavis, you know, I could talk to you all night and I would love to have you back on for another conversation. But before we wrap, I just want to give you a moment to share any final words of wisdom, thoughts, or advice for our audience this evening.
Well, thank you. I want to end on an optimistic note. I would like to share with you what gives me my greatest hope. My greatest hope is our young people today. I think the youth today are our best generation of geniuses. They're gifted, they're talented, they're Black. The only thing that I see sometimes in the way of our young people reaching higher heights of success in their aspirations is they don't get enough encouragement from people in my generation or people in any generation. I think we need to encourage our young people not to be complacent, not to accept, don't get frustrated, don't get wore out, and certainly don't go to sleep. You know, woke means not just being conscious, but it means what you do with your consciousness. And as I move around the United States, I'm proud to report to you, I'm pleased to report to you that I see a generation of freedom fighters emerging. They're conscious, they're seeking truth. And a lot of times you got these young people in these classrooms who are more thirsty for truth and information than their teachers. So they go out and try to find additional information, which is okay. So we have to guide them. That's where the Black press comes in. We have to make sure that our portals have the information that young people are searching for that will help further encourage them, not only to become freedom fighters, but win freedom, justice, and equality, and equity, and empowerment for all of God's people. That's my message.
And it was a powerful message. Dr. Chavis, thank you so much for joining us. To all those who've tuned in, Dr. Chavis says, stay woke. We have to stay woke. It's so important. And I love when we end on a positive note. You know, I just want to remind everyone that Black media matters. Black journalists matter. Black stories matter. And yes, our voices matter. So remember, whether you're talking about journalism or you're talking about civic engagement or economic justice or environmental justice, our voices are critical and essential to all of these things. If we don't tell our stories, no one else will. So for all of you that tuned in, thank you so much. Dr. Chavis, thank you so much. And I hope you join us next time for the next conversation. Remember, the time for justice is always now. Take care, Dr. Chavis. Thank you, everyone. Good night.
God bless.